Okay, everybody, I am back. Hopefully, eventually, you'll all be back as well. I was talking about modeling form and how I was using planes to kind of model form. So if you were in the previous stream that cut out, sorry, I'm just going to start over those topics again. So the question that I was talking about really was about planes. So I was saying that these three kind of values here represent planes, and this is how I think about modeling form, which is, I think, what commonly could be understood as shading or blending. It's my personal feeling that those words are maybe a little bit misleading in the sense that it's not so much about getting the material to flow in between these three planes. It's about isolating softly each kind of value transition, value plane, and making sure that you express them clearly and simply. That's how I go about creating a sense of roundness or form in my drawings. And while I know that some of this, I've been so deep into academia for the last decade or so that I probably some of this sounds like I'm just chopping up words unnecessarily. But I think the reality is, like, the way that we think about drawing is the way that we talk about drawing is the way that we think about drawing. And if your thought process about drawing is not improved and refined, I think that you'll probably risk to maybe not have as clear a grasp of your process as you'd like to have. So that's maybe my statement just about kind of blending or modeling or creating form. And then the follow-up question to this was, how do you learn to do that? There's several ways. I think probably the most important way is simply to gain experience. That being said, you have to be kind of motivated to gain that experience. The easiest way to learn about form and roundness is actually just to draw like generic geometrical forms. So a sphere or a cone or a cube in a lighting situation similar to this one, just drawing those values is a great way to understand how the application of value creates a sense of form based on the direction of a plane. If for you it is not interesting enough to work on a geometrical form like a cone or a sphere or whatever, I can respect and understand that. It's not maybe the most fun or engaging project to draw on. I learned most of this just through drawing portraits. The difficulty about that, of course, is that a portrait is highly complicated, and there's a lot of different things that you're simultaneously trying to learn about. Not just how to turn form and use values, but how to construct the features and create a sense of like symmetry. All of these things are really challenging, and so it's my feeling that if you have the commitment to kind of take them a la carte, or to take them kind of one at a time, focus on how to turn form and then learn about portraiture, I think that that's really valuable and really useful. So the easiest way probably to learn about planes and form is through drawing these simplified geometrical forms. In lieu of that, just keep drawing heads. And keep drawing heads in such a way that you're focused on not just the softness and smoothness of form, but how to kind of model or etch out the planes of the face. This is the kind of key to that. There's another question that is maybe a little bit, I don't know if it's peripheral or kind of a side note. But it was, what medium do I use for glazing? I just use a bit of linseed oil. My oil painting process is so simplified. I use almost nothing that is too complex. It's really about, for me, being able to focus on trying to render out the planes of the model that I'm working with. There's almost nothing else that exists for me in painting, in the sense that, like, I'm not trying to Giuseppe Ribera or something try to sculpt the form of the face out of oil paint. That's not so much for me. I want to create a good impression, and a good construction, and a good expression. There's an interesting question. I'm not sure so much if there's an answer to this one, but it came up in relationship to this live stream. But someone was asking me, how do you make the portraits look alive? I suppose that probably the answer to that question is maybe there are more layers to that than are, strictly speaking, like answerable in terms of like a technique. There's not like really a technique that I use to make them seem so alive, but I think that it's partly, that you have to like prioritize what you want your drawing to be about. In portraits, the drawing is always about the expression. And of course, the eyes are a really big part of that expression. So one of the ways that you can make a portrait engaging really is to kind of create a composition that accentuates that aspect, right? And even then, once you've created your composition, taking choices that always are there to kind of accentuate the eyes or the features of the face. I think this is the way that we associate with people making a portrait that looks very alive. So this is my answer to that. There's another question, and this question comes up constantly. I get it all the time, and I think it's a question that comes up with the absolute best intent, which is, people really want to learn about how to make or what the process of making a portrait is, and the question is like, what books do you recommend? And I've always been very hesitant to say that like, this is the book for portraiture, because I honestly, I don't really feel like there is one. There are a lot of interesting, intriguing books about drawing, but they are all subject to one thing, and that is for the person reading them to be able to truly understand what they're about. This is the difficult thing. Really, the best way to learn, I think, about drawing and painting is through experience. There's not really a substitute for drawing and painting models that are in a good lighting situation. This is part of the reason why I started adding the model packs into my Patreon, is that I would be working with students and seeing their work, and the lighting situations that they were using were not always as conducive as they could be to kind of learning quite well. So that experience, like I said, yes, it's irreplaceable, but it has to, or it's best used if it happens in circumstances that are favorable. The best way to learn about the ideas like taking place in this drawing is to draw in a lighting situation that also is similar to this one. I was looking at another artist who was fielding this question recently, and I thought his answer was actually a really apt one. And so I'll share it with you now. But he was saying that, I've actually kind of forgotten a little bit of what he was saying, but I will paraphrase and I'll kind of give you the basis for what he said. Really, that there is not a good one. There is not a good book to teach you drawing. There are interesting books, but they are not in a way for that purpose. They are not there to teach you everything about drawing. They're there to supplement your experience drawing. And really that kind of just dovetails with my idea for or about books, is that they're interesting and engaging, and in the end, like, they're not as useful as just setting up in front of a model and working. Some of the other questions that I get, and this will also be covered a lot in, or actually was covered a lot in this month's Patreon video where I was doing this portrait painting. But what colors you use for skin tones? Really, there's any amount of color that you can use for a skin tone. It's not necessary that you pick a particular set of colors. My palette over the years has changed from sometimes being using phthalo turquoise in skin tones, sometimes using the simplest thing possible, like this last portrait that I didn't even use any blue on the palette. It's only ivory black is like the coldest temperature or coldest color that I've used. So it varies. I do think, though, just in reference to asking about palettes and trying to understand palettes, really it's about, again, kind of getting to know the one that you do have. So one thing I would recommend is to have some basis, have something to start with, right? And get to know what those colors will and will not do. Try and paint a still life with the same palette, right? Like, let's say the one that I used on last month's, where I had ivory black, had vermilion, yellow brown, and flake white, right? Painting skin with that, it's really, really adept, right? In that it kind of captures a lot of the kind of subtlety of the shifting kind of temperatures of skin tones. If I tried to paint, let's say, a sunset with that palette, or even better, like a bright midday landscape at the beach, I don't think that palette necessarily would be so conducive to it. Inevitably, I would come up with something, but it probably wouldn't be like the most have the most kind of fidelity to nature if I was painting that scene with that palette. And this is the recommendation maybe I would make just for anybody like thinking about how to choose their palette and what to use, is just consider what is the subject that you're trying to paint. If you're trying to paint something very colorful, you're going to need that extra chroma. So you're going to choose colors or pigments that are going to do that for you. If you're painting something, again, like what I paint, kind of studio portraiture, it doesn't require that I go too far out from something very standard and very simple. But it's all about what you want. And remember, it's about taking a conscious decision about your process and about your materials. I mean, everything even down to your brushes, is a choice. And I think it doesn't really register among students a lot of times, like that their materials, their brushes are affecting the way that their painting looks, right? If you use only large hog bristle brushes, your painting is going to look a certain way. If you use only, soft sable brushes, your painting is going to look a certain way. If you use no oil medium to thin the paint whatsoever versus using a medium that is quite rich with turpentine, again, it's going to cause the surface of your painting to look a different way, and knowing that means you can also be in control of that. And this is the place that I would like students to be, in a place where they're making conscious choices, and those choices are taken with the understanding that everything that they do will affect their outcome, right? And I know that's a lot to probably grasp. If you're not too experienced in doing this, it's a lot to kind of grab a hold of mentally. But over time, these things, you kind of come to understand them cumulatively, right? Which is, for me, that's how the process went for me, is that I didn't, I don't think that I was a particularly quick study in terms of integrating these academic ideas into my work. It took a while before I really kind of understood what I was supposed to be doing. Even in a sense, after I was already doing the things I was being asked to do. I was making drawings that looked like they made sense, but I can't say that I really knew so well what I was doing with them. Side note for those of you that are here, I don't know if you have seen this one yet. But this is an entirely new development that I'll talk about in the making of next month's Patreon video. What you're seeing is a 0.9 millimeter pencil with white chalk inside of it, which you probably aren't as excited as I am about this, but I've been searching. This is like the holy grail for me. I've been searching for this for ages. and I've finally gotten to try it out on this portrait, and it's been everything that I hoped for and more. So in the next month's video, I'll talk about this a lot, and how excited I was to kind of find it, and also I'll share links in that post to where you can get it, at least where you can get it in the US. Yeah, I know, as some of you are commenting now. Yes, exactly. It's crazy, right? White chalk in a mechanical pencil. Again, this is something I've been having conversations with people about for ages, and only just recently did I find it. Now, there's also a version of it that I found for the 2mm lead holder, the Rapid Pro 2.0. I haven't actually tried this one out yet. I'm sure it'll be cool, but maybe not as cool as what this one is. Yeah, so look forward to that. Let's see, some more questions. Someone was asking, of course, that the palette that I'm using, or that I used in the last month's painting of Cornelia, right? That all of you, if you have gotten the chance to watch it, that's cool. But that's what I put out for this month. It was a portrait done with a limited palette, right? Which you could refer to as the kind of Zorn palette, right? Now, whether this is like technically perfectly accurate, this is what it has come to mean in the modern kind of expression of it. So the Zorn palette is effectively red, black, white, and yellow. And he was famous for having used this quite limited palette to make a lot of expression in his paintings. I do want to side note and say, Nancy, thank you so much for gifting me this 9mm pencil. If any of you are looking for these online, you might find that they're very, for whatever reason, very scarce right now. A workshop student gave me one, so thank you very much for that, Nancy. Back to the Zorn palette. The idea of using a limited palette, I think, is one that is very attractive in academia, and because we're all about kind of simplifying in order to try to understand, or to try to communicate and teach. But a lot of painters, when they get out and kind of work on their own, maybe have a tendency to look for a palette that's a little bit more expansive. And I can understand that completely. I still like the limitation of a Zorn palette, and I'll tell you why. I find a lot of freedom inside of like a limitation. So what I give up in terms of having, a dozen or so colors on my palette, that kind of immediate variety, I think it's boiled down into a more kind of simplified kind of freedom. And it's something that allows me to focus, I think, more on the actual rendering out of form, right? And the actual design and qualities that maybe I just am more attracted to than a vast diversity of color. This is in no way like a qualitative statement that I think it's better for you to work in a limited way than to work in with a palette that is more expansive. It's only that, as I've reiterated over and over, it's only about your individual taste and expression. And just knowing that either one of those that you choose, again, it just has an outcome, it has a consequence, and not a consequence in like a bad way, but like every choice that you make has a consequence in terms of how your artwork, the expression of your artwork is affected by that choice. So just remember that, think about, I think of it also in terms of like almost free association, which is to say like, what are the messages? What are like the words? What are the ideas that I want to kind of drift into people's minds when they're looking at my work? And then I kind of work backward and ask myself, what are the choices that I'm taking? Are they supporting that idea? Like by choosing a palette that has 20 colors, am I conjuring up the effects and the reactions and the responses, the experiences that I want to conjure up? The answer only is that I am or am not. And again, especially without attaching a qualitative value to that. I think that questions like that become very interesting to me. It's sometimes in the art world, because the purposes and reasons for things can be so, I think specious would be the word, but they can be so debatable, right? I think that maybe there's a tendency to become a little bit defensive about your positions on various topics like expression and palettes and different kinds of rendering and modeling and subject matter. I like the idea of being a lot more open. I think that there are so many different modes of expression, even just within the genres of realism, that it's not required to have a top 10 list of what's better and what's worse. But maybe I'm also just saying things that people are already thinking. I don't claim to be like the originator of these thoughts, but I like the idea of a world of artistic expression that's a little bit more multifaceted, where we just look at what is the expression, what is the outcome, what do they want, and what do I gain from that experience. All right, so I've got a couple more questions. I'm not going to do maybe a full hour here because I do have, unfortunately, a whole lot going on today. But let's see. Someone's asking, what is the first stage of making a portrait? Well, of course, we generically call it like a block-in, right? So we go from having nothing on the paper to then having a world represented on the paper. We have to get from one place to the other. And the metaphor that I like for this actually is the idea of, I remember once, I'm such like a storyteller, whatever. So once I was I was biking into school when I was studying in Florence, and biked on this long kind of stretch of highway in the wintertime, and there's these just trees, incredibly tall, millions of branches. And this is like how deep I was in my student days. My mind was so attuned to all this stuff that I was thinking, well, what would your process be if you wanted to draw one of these trees, like a million branches, how would you recommend somebody to draw that? And of course you think then, well, you have to start from the broad and go to the specific. Maybe you would start with the trunk of the tree and start with then the largest branches that emanated from that trunk, and then the smaller ones and smaller ones and smaller ones, until such time as you had faithfully indicated, all of these millions of branches. Now, not that you would ever do that. My point being that method, that rational process of going from the simple or the broad into the specific is a basic outline of how I go about my work. I'm always concerned with how simple a version of something can I make at what stage, and how can that allow me then to focus on really mastering what is usually the very subtle expression of the features. Looking at the face now, there are a million things happening. How do I break it down? What is the tree trunk here? What is the simplest version of this? To me, it has always been like this front plane versus side plane versus top plane. If I can basically make a head that is like a block of marble that then I can kind of sculpt out of. This is what I think of in terms of what the first stage is. It's the simplest possible expression of the subject. Reese Osborne is asking, do you usually use photos or models or a mix of both? I have talked about this on previous live streams, but I'm happy to discuss it again because it is a place or a question that a lot of artists or students find themselves asking. What do I do? How do I work? I work from both. I spent obviously all of my student years at the Florence Academy. I spent working from life. And for several years after that, I only ever really worked that way. So there was a lot of self-portraits and some very precious time with models that you have to pay quite a bit per hour. But eventually I discovered that, for me, I didn't, for the kind of expression I wanted, the bending point was not going to be whether I worked from life or from photographs. It was really just how well I worked and how much I got to work with the figure. So I started integrating the use of photography in my work, and I've done that ever since. Some of the videos that you see that I produced, like I did a video with a guy called Stan Prokopenko last year, and I'll do one with New Masters Academy coming up this year, where I'll be working from life. And so to me, again, the difference was not so much for what I wanted. There are other artists that for whom it's a major part of their expression that they will only work from life, and I think that's really a great choice as well. I don't have again a problem with either one. I have a little bit of a problem with the kind of like the binary attitudes that kind of come up about it, as if you can only be one or only be the other. I think it's quite a bit of nonsense, and I think there's a lot of like kind of art shaming that goes on in various communities, and I'm completely against that. Everybody has to kind of find their pathway through it, and you can be a realist painter in one way, and you can be a realist painter in another way, and it's probably not for other people to tell you how you have to work. That's my sort of sticking point. But thank you, Reese, for that question. Let's see. I'm just scanning through some of the questions here. There's a question. It's fairly generic in one sense, but maybe we can make something interesting out of it. That how can we make a portrait look more realistic? Is it the right values or the right colors? This is a great, there is something inside this question that is great, which is to say that, like, what is a realistic portrait? Even then, let's take a step further back also and say, what is accuracy exactly, right? We've all had like struggles attaining what we felt was accuracy. What I noticed in terms of a trend over the years, like again, I've been teaching and working with some very committed students here at the Florence Academy for 10 years now. And over that time, you notice certain trends in what it is to actually be educated as an artist. One of the things that changes is our conception of accuracy, like what actually is accuracy. At a certain point, students really want to treat accuracy as if it is a line or a single point in space. And this leads them to making very, very sharp edges, really all over their picture. Now, what you notice, like in a face like this, is that in between all of these values and all these value shapes, there is scarcely an edge that you can define. They're very soft edges, right? So what does that mean? Are they, because they are softer, are they not as accurate? The phrase that comes up that I think is most useful in this instance is soft but specific. In order to be accurate, you must be accurate in shape, in size, in orientation, but also in terms of edge. It would be inaccurate to say that this edge, at the edge of the nose here, where one form is overlapping another form, is the same kind of edge as the edge in between these halftones. This edge, nonetheless, is necessary to be accurate, just like this is, but they take a different form in doing so. And this is a little bit the evolution that has to take place. If we really want our drawing to be more realistic, we need to pay attention to the hierarchy and organization that we see in nature. Let's see, Hannah, I think that's your name here, is asking a question. Did you always use the block-in technique, or did you pass through the revealing stage, drawing one eye, then the other, etc.? If yes, how different are the two techniques? Well, as long as I have been educated, right, which is to say when I started going to the academy, I've used this method of kind of blocking in going from broad to specific in one form or another. It has evolved over time to take a slightly different shape, just like it does for all students. But I think previous to that, I may have probably worked from like one place out into others. I don't know that like there's not a can't about it. The differences in my experience were always that going from the broad into the specific gave me a lot more kind of confidence and clarity moving forward. When I stopped drawing the eyes and started drawing the head, this was like a really kind of big change for me, like in my thinking and my application to this work. So I do think, I have to say that for a student, there's probably a qualitative difference in between those two ways of working, which is to say I do think it is a superior exercise to draw the head, not to draw only the features. Whether or not you can come across a teacher who will say the opposite, I don't know. But and if there was a very good reason for the alternative, I would be very interested to hear it. But just for my own purposes, I would say it's always about drawing the head. It's always about finding the large kind of planes of the head. I think that is the thing to me that where I gained really the confidence of accuracy was when I started working in that manner. But it's a very good question. Thank you for that. There's one more question that I have here that I thought I could get to, and it was, do you think alla prima is better as it gives the first sincere impression, which is hard to maintain through many days? Alla prima painting, for those of you if you know or don't know, it just means painting in one layer. So prima in Italian is first. So you're saying alla prima is of the first. And yeah, it can be a great way to capture a very kind of direct, quick impression. Experientially, I'll say, having painted in a lot of different ways and spent some time painting alla prima, and I still do, like when I paint landscapes, for instance. I will say that first impression, let's say if you've ever written something, right? Think about what your first draft was. Your first draft, you thought things were a certain way, and over time and analysis, you maybe realized that they were a different way. This is a little bit how I think about alla prima painting versus maybe painting in a series of stages and layers. I feel like the latter offers you the possibility to make eventually more informed decisions. Now, that has consequences as well. And that's brought up in this question. Also, there is this question of freshness. And John Singer Sargent's portrait teacher in Paris, Carlos Duran, talks about exactly this question when he said that attaining like freshness in a sketch, right, alla prima painting, is one thing. It is very challenging to maintain that freshness after many layers of painting. Now, it's not so much to throw down the gauntlet and say one is just harder than the other. But I think what he's saying there is that there is a value in that, in vitality, in that freshness. And if you want to achieve it, it's very possible, but it does have its own set of challenges. So for me, I do really actually like the appearance of a really well painted picture that is very fresh. I'm just also after that sense of like clarity as well. So I want the freshness, but I also want the clarity. And so there are creative solutions that you can come up with for that. Like for instance, just speaking of my own experience, what I started to do with my oil paint after a while was I would actually add a couple of drops of clove oil to my linseed oil. Clove oil, of course, is it's an oil that is a drying oil, but it takes way longer to dry than linseed oil. And so what it does is it extends the wetness cycle of linseed oil for several days, depending on how much you add into your mixture. So it would allow me to kind of paint alla prima, but also to keep it fresh for 3 days. The paint would still be wet each day that I would kind of come into the studio. So that's the kind of thing where you can take an idea or a quality that you want and figure out how to use your materials to get you to a place where you can do that in the way that you want. For me, it was not enough to paint in one day. I could not realize the clarity that I wanted in one day. I needed more time. That's when I went to a medium to actually try to augment my materials to give me the solution that I was looking for.